Hi there guys, my name's Conor and I am a wildlife artist that specialises in both graphite and scratchboard. So welcome into the third and final part of this how to draw a graphite French Bulldog. So in parts 1 we covered how to do the eyes and a little bit of the texture surrounding the eyes, and in part 2 we covered how to do the ears. Now in this third and final part we're going to look at how we create the muzzle and the nose texture. Now this is probably one of the more complex areas throughout the whole piece. There's a lot of different texture, a lot of different tonal changes and really deep dark contrast. Now if you've missed any of the first two parts, don't worry, I have linked them down below in the description. So I hope you guys enjoy it, and without further ado, let's get started. Right then guys, time to start work on this muzzle. Now this is probably going to end up being one of the more complicated areas of this whole piece, more complex than the eyes and probably a bit more complicated than the ears. But it's the part that I wanted to enjoy the most because I feel like this is what's going to really bring this piece together. So the tools that we're going to be using in this one are going to be pretty much exactly the same as the ones we've been using in the previous two parts. I will leave a list down in the description for you. But just to briefly go over them, I'm going to be using my indenting tool. So for this one, I'm going to be using a dart that I've just blunted on the end so it's not sharp anymore. I'm going to be using my Caran pencils, and they're going to be mainly kept blunt throughout the whole of this piece. And then I'm also going to be using my mechanical pencils, and they're from Staedtler. Now the reason I use two different types of pencils is because my Caran pencils I like to keep blunt, because when I run those over my indenting marks, it's not going to go into those indenting marks and it's going to keep them nice and bright. Whereas with my Staedtler pencils, I like to keep them sharp so that I can still get those fine hairs, and I can also work back into those indenting marks to darken them up if needed. Now I initially started working on the outside of this muzzle, and I was working in, as you can see here, sort of small sections at a time, really trying to map out where those creases of the wrinkles on the face. Now I soon realised that this wasn't really going to work for this area. The area was quite small and it was quite difficult to really build up the tones and the values that I needed using this method. So in a moment what you'll see me do is swap to the same technique that I use for the ears on this piece. So that's where I use my graphite powder to help block in those initial values and those dark tones. Now there's a lot of different textures in this muzzle. It's almost where, so the first starts off as quite like a short fur just on the edge of this muzzle, and then as it transitions more to the center line it gets quite thin and then really transitions into more of a skin texture. So that's what I was sort of battling with here, trying to get that right base layer for this area. Now for my graphite powder, what I tend to do is I blend down either a 2B or a 9B graphite stick or a graphite block, and that's what I mainly use for my graphite powder. And then what I do is dip my blending stump into that and then use that to work on the paper. Now I use that to give me fairly like a smooth base tone, and I find that that works a little bit better than using my pencils to try and shade over. I don't find I get as much texture of the paper showing through, so it works really well if I want to keep that really smooth texture and that really smooth base texture. Now I wanted to work on the left side of this muzzle first, just to try and get the right technique that I wanted to use before moving across onto the right side of this muzzle. So it's a little bit of a slower technique to begin with, just as I'm trying to map out the different areas of tone and also trying to work out what techniques I want to bring forward. So I decided to use my sort of fur texture technique for the outer parts of this muzzle, which involved me laying down a indenting fur technique and then working back over the top with my blunted Caran pencils and also my sharper Staedtler pencils. and I wanted to try and then blend it out as I came towards the midline. So as I'm working towards that midline of the muzzle, I'm using more of my graphite powder and then working over the top to add in those fur textures. Now you'll see me keep coming in as well with my Kneadable eraser. Now I'm using that to try and pick out those highlights and those clumps of fur in case I've gone a little bit too dark. Now the whole piece as a whole really hasn't had that final layer go over the top of it. It's all roughly about 80 to 85% complete. I don't really want to put my darkest values in at this stage, because this muzzle for me, it was always going to be one of the darkest areas of the whole piece, along with sort of the eye region or the areas around the eye. So what I didn't want to do was go too dark on another area and then struggle to make this area as dark as I wanted it to. So I tried to keep the rest of the piece about 85% complete, and then when I'm working on this area, this is where I'm now trying to work up to that darkest level that I want this to be, so that I can judge the other tones of the piece off of it. Now it is a bit of a slow area to work on because there's a lot of very subtle tonal transitions. There's not much difference now in the technique that I'm using. As you can see here, I'm using my indenting tool on those sort of brighter, more in focus areas of fur on the outer edge of this muzzle, and then as I work towards the center, we're moving into that graphite powder. Now because we've laid down that graphite powder, when we're indenting over the top of that, it's not pushing the white of the paper now down into those indenting marks, it's pushing the graphite down. So when we then go over the top of it, the hair strokes that are in that area are now a darker tone compared to the other ones. So if you've ever got an area such as this where you want those fur strokes to be not bright white and you want them to have a bit of darker tone to them, lay that initial dark tone down with your graphite powder and then put your initial indenting marks over the top of it, so that then when you go over with your even darker your darker pencils and your softer pencils, those lighter hairs are actually those mid-tone hairs. Now I'm still using just my two different lead softnesses here, so I'm still just using my 2B and my 4B. I haven't quite worked my way up to my 6Bs and my 8Bs yet, but by the end of this piece I will be using those ones just to make it extra dark. Now I was struggling to get my hand to sort of work its way around to this upper part of the nose, and also the fur in this area was incredibly short, and there was a lot of different fur texture changes or fur directional changes also. So what I did here was I turned my piece upside down just so that it was a little bit easier to work with. But the techniques that I'm using here are still exactly the same. On those areas that I want that really bright fur, like here where I'm working underneath this eye or on this sort of fold around the eye, this area is quite a bright area in the piece, so I'm not laying down any graphite initially, and what I'm ending up doing is working back into that with my graphite pencils. But if we compare that to the area just above the nose here, where it's a little bit like more of a darker texture, I've laid down a layer of graphite powder first before putting those indenting marks down. And don't worry if you go a little bit too dark, you can always use your Kneadable eraser just to pick out those highlights again. So now I've started to work down on the sort of lower parts of this muzzle and just refining some of the texture. Now you'll see me here going in with my makeup brush, and what I'm doing here is on those areas that are just a little bit too bright, it's just pushing that graphite powder or that graphite down into those indenting marks. So if you're finding that you're having a few areas that are a little bit too bright or a little bit too stark, you can just blend them out and it does just push that graphite down and into there. And I found a makeup brush works really quite well for this, but you can use anything. You can use a blending stump or even just a bit of tissue if that's all you've got. And at this stage here, I'm starting now to add in my darker values. So you can see just to the left hand side of where the actual nose is, I've got a bit of a darker tone. Now that was created using my 6B pencil. So I've started to now work with those softer leads just to try and slowly build up that darkness. Now the paper that I was using here is the Strathmore Bristol paper. Now it is the smooth paper, it's not the vellum, so there's not a great deal of tooth to this paper, but I kind of wanted that for this piece. I didn't want to be working hard against that grain of the paper. I wanted in quite a few different areas to have more of a smooth tone. So for example, in the eyes themselves and the ears, and also a little bit on this muzzle, I wanted it to be, I didn't want to have that challenge of trying to remove the texture of the paper, but that means that I don't have as much tooth to grab onto the graphite, so I have to be careful with my layers here. I don't want to put down too many layers because in that sense I'm going to struggle to build those up. And then finally, before we start moving on to the actual nose, I'm just making sure that I haven't got that ring of white around the edge of this muzzle that's going to look like a bit of a halo. I'm just going to add in those final little fur textures that are just going to overlap into the body area itself. So it's finally time to start working on the actual nose itself. So for this, I'm going to use my indenting technique again, just because I find this gives a really nice nose texture. But instead of doing it as fur strokes, I'm going to do almost like a scribbling pattern or a figure of 8 pattern. And I find this just helps really replicate that bumpy nose texture. So I'm making sure to map out the areas that are going to be most dark on this nose, so those nostril creases themselves, and also that central line, just because I don't want to lose those as I'm building up the darkness on this nose. And the nose is always a little bit of a harder texture to replicate, and it is very similar to the eyes in regards to it being a bit of a standout feature for most animals, but especially this French Bulldog. But I'm making sure just to slow things down, just to really pay attention to my reference photo, working out where those lights and those darks are. And here, a lot of the time, after I've laid down that first base layer, I am going around with my mechanical pencil and also my makeup brush, just to try and soften those textured marks on the nose and really try and blend it in. So we're coming to the final parts of this piece now. This was definitely one of the more complex areas to draw, but it was also the most rewarding. I really do feel like it's brought everything together with this French Bulldog. Now, if you followed along with all 3 parts, thank you so much. I hope it's really helped you feel more confident working in graphite and tackling the more challenging areas such as this. So if you found it helpful, I'd really appreciate a like or a comment, or even just let me know how your own piece is going. You can message me over on my social media channels or just in the comments below. So don't forget to subscribe. I've also got more tutorials coming up soon in both graphite and scratchboard if you're interested. So I'll leave you guys watching the final parts of this tutorial just as I add in the final touches on this graphite piece. And I hope you guys have really enjoyed it, and I'll see you all again in the next one.